Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply unsettling stories about attics, those dusty, forgotten spaces above our heads that we rarely visit but can never quite forget about. These aren't tales about finding old treasures or family heirlooms. These are real experiences from real people who discovered that the space above their ceiling wasn't as empty or as safe as they'd always assumed. Before we dive in, I want to know, do you have an attic in your home? Have you ever felt uncomfortable going up there? There's something uniquely unsettling about attics, the way they sit above us while we sleep, the darkness, the creaking sounds we can never quite explain. Drop a comment and share your experiences. Because what you're about to hear will make you think twice before pulling down that ladder and climbing up into the darkness above your home. Alright, let's begin. And remember, every word of these stories is true. Story 1, The Sleepwalker. When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement did. I don't really know why. Most people are more afraid of basements, the darkness below, the unknown depths. But there was something about our attic that really got to me on a fundamental level. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you're probably picturing right now. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are cramped and congested, forcing you to crouch or crawl through tight spaces. But our attic was built in such a way that you didn't ever have to crouch when you were up there. You could stand fully upright and walk around freely. You might think that would make it less scary, that the extra space would imply we used it more often, treated it like a normal room. But no. My parents treated it like a glorified storage space. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided going up there as much as possible. They'd send me or my older sister up to grab things rather than go themselves, which I always found odd but never questioned as a kid. The other thing about our attic, and this is what really got to me, was that it had so many nooks and crannies built into it. The space was broken up by odd support beams and small changes in elevation, almost like a makeshift maze. The beams were of uneven thickness, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. Some were thick and structural, others were thinner and seemed purely decorative or accidental. The result was that you couldn't stand in any one place and have a clear line of sight from one end of the attic to the other. And the flooring was a nightmare. The floor level changed randomly, up a few inches here, down a step there, uneven joists that you had to carefully navigate. My dad used to joke that one day, one of us would slip, fall through the insulation, and punch a hole right through the ceiling below. So you can imagine why an attic like that would be scary to a little kid. The maze-like quality was what freaked me out the most. I really didn't like not being able to see the entire space at once. Every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of those beams, just out of sight, watching me. What I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't have a ton of other clear memories from that period in my life. Most of my childhood is pleasant but vague. But this memory is so vivid, so sharp and detailed, that it feels like a thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic childhood. It happened during the school week. I remember that specifically because I had class the next day. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. Probably 12 or 13. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. Not just a little dusty, they were properly filthy. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of grit between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I'd eaten dinner with my family, done my homework, watched TV for a bit, then gone to bed. Nothing unusual. I'd just gone to sleep like normal and woken up with feet that looked like I'd been walking through dirt for hours. Being a kid, I didn't give it too much thought beyond that initial confusion. I just washed my feet in the bathtub, got dressed, and went to school. Things only escalated from there, though. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was a small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs. None whatsoever. When I asked my mom about it during breakfast, she just assumed I'd been rummaging through the attic for some reason, maybe looking for old family photos for a school project or something. I told her I hadn't been up there, that I had no idea how the box got into my room. But she didn't seem concerned. She just took the box back upstairs herself, and that was that. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing with a stained lampshade that I vaguely recognized from the attic. This time, I was absolutely certain I hadn't brought it down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through the house. It wasn't something you could do unconsciously. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it had always belonged there. That's when things started clicking into place. The dirty feet. the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic specifically, navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in complete darkness, completely unconscious, bringing things back to my room without any memory of doing so. The realization didn't scare me immediately, but it made me feel deeply strange, unsettled. The idea that my body was doing things without my knowledge or consent, that I was moving through the house like a puppet on strings while my conscious mind was completely absent, it was disturbing in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I told my parents about it that night at dinner. I explained the dirty feet, the items appearing in my room, my conclusion that I must be sleepwalking up to the attic. They reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I'd probably grow out of it soon. They weren't dismissive exactly, but they weren't overly concerned either. To them, it was just one of those things kids go through, like growing pains or nightmares. But to me, it felt like more than that. It felt wrong. After that conversation, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie in bed for hours, fighting sleep, terrified of what might happen once I lost consciousness. What if I fell down the attic stairs? What if I walked right through that weak spot in the floor my dad always warned about? I couldn't fight sleep forever, though. Eventually, exhaustion would win. And every single morning, the first thing I did when I woke up was frantically check my feet. If they were clean, it had been a good night. I'd stayed in bed, stayed safe. If they were dirty, covered in that telltale grime and dust from the attic floor, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, thankfully. But those few times they weren't really got to me, because there was no denying it anymore. I was going up to the attic regularly, multiple times a week, and I had absolutely no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending hours up there, wandering around in the dark, doing God knows what, completely unconscious. The fear I felt during that period was different from anything I'd ever experienced before or since. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror of seeing something scary. It was a slow, creeping dread that never went away. A constant low-level anxiety that followed me everywhere. It was awful. But nothing was scarier than what happened next. I woke up one night, only it wasn't morning. It was still dark outside. The kind of deep, complete darkness that only exists in the middle of the night. It took me a few seconds to fully wake up, to transition from unconsciousness to awareness. And as I did, I realized something that made my blood turn to ice. I wasn't in my bed. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing, upright, in complete darkness. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even process what was happening. I just stood there, frozen, trying to understand. And then the recognition hit me like a physical blow. I was in the attic. I was in the attic, in the middle of the night, in pitch-black darkness, with no memory of how I got there. The fear that washed over me was so intense, so overwhelming, that I almost couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I couldn't see a single thing. Not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch I'd climbed through, nothing. Just absolute, impenetrable blackness in every direction. And to make matters infinitely worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was. Which corner? How far from the hatch? Near the weak spots in the floor or somewhere safe? I had no reference points. No way to orient myself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. It was like sleep paralysis amplified 100 times. I knew the layout of the attic, but only vaguely, only from memory. And I knew there were obstacles everywhere. Beams at head height, changes in floor elevation, holes in the insulation. The idea of trying to find my way back to the hatch in complete darkness felt impossible. But I couldn't just stand there forever. So I started moving. Slowly. Painfully. One tiny step at a time, my hands outstretched in front of me, feeling blindly for obstacles. I was terrified I'd trip and fall through the ceiling, or walk face first into a beam, or step on a weak board and crash through to the floor below. I was crying. Silently, tears just streaming down my face, but I was trying desperately not to make any noise. Because I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I don't know what gave me that impression. I hadn't heard anything. Hadn't seen anything, I couldn't see anything at all. But I could feel it. The presence of something else in that darkness with me. Something deeper in the attic, behind one of those beams I couldn't see past. And then I actually heard something. A soft thud from somewhere behind me. It sounded like a footstep. Or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I froze completely, every muscle in my body locked up. I stood there in absolute silence, barely breathing, straining to hear. Then I heard it again. Another soft sound. But this time it seemed to come from a different direction, off to my left instead of behind me. A few seconds later, another sound. From my right this time. Whatever was up there with me was moving. Circling. Getting closer. I started moving faster, no longer caring about being quiet or careful. I just needed to find that hatch. My hands touched a wall, concrete, rough against my palms. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a corner, to something recognizable. Then my foot found the edge of the hatch opening. I'd almost stepped right into it, would have fallen through if I'd been moving any faster. I dropped to my knees and practically threw myself down through the opening, not even bothering with the ladder. I just wanted out. I hit the hallway floor hard, scrambled to my feet, and ran straight to my parents' room. I didn't knock. I just burst through the door, fully sobbing now, unable to hold it in anymore. My mom woke up first, sitting up in bed with a startled expression. "Honey? What's wrong?" I could barely get the words out between sobs. I told her what had happened, how I'd woken up in the attic, in complete darkness, how I'd had to feel my way back to the hatch in the dark. And I told her about the sounds. About the thing I'd heard moving around up there. I expected my dad to leap out of bed, to grab a flashlight or a baseball bat and charge up there to check. To protect me. But he didn't. Neither of them really took me seriously. My mom just pulled me into a hug and said it was okay, that sleepwalking could be disorienting and scary, but that I was safe now. My dad barely even woke up. He just mumbled something about putting a lock on the attic hatch if it would make me feel better. I said yes, obviously. But I knew what I'd heard. Those sounds were real. I insisted, begged, that they at least check the attic. Just to make sure there was nothing up there. My dad finally agreed, more to calm me down than out of any real concern. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, watching as he climbed up with a flashlight. My heart was pounding. Part of me genuinely thought he wasn't going to come back down. That whatever was up there would get him. But not 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down. "There's nothing up there," he said, yawning. "Just boxes and dust. Go back to bed." So that's what I did. But lying in bed that night, knowing what I'd experienced, knowing what I'd heard, it was the worst night of my life. I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from above, waiting for something to come through my door. After that incident, the sleepwalking stopped. Completely. I never had another episode. Part of me wonders if my dad did put a lock on the hatch like he'd suggested, but I never saw one and he never mentioned it again. I'm a lot older now. I've moved out, gotten married, started my own life. But I've never been able to fully accept the sleepwalking explanation for what happened. I know that's the most logical answer. Sleepwalking is a real, documented phenomenon. There's nothing supernatural about it. But there are things that don't add up. The way I always ended up in the same place, the attic, never anywhere else in the house. Never the kitchen, never the living room, always the attic. The way I was apparently capable of navigating that maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without hurting myself even once. And most of all, that night. The night I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard, multiple sounds, from different directions, like something was deliberately circling me. I still believe there was something up there with me that night. I really do. What it was, I have no idea. But it was there. I've brought this up to my parents several times over the years, trying to get them to take it seriously, to help me make sense of it. But they always give me the same dismissive answers. You were just a kid. Sleepwalking can be scary. You probably imagine the sounds. Sometimes I get the feeling they don't want to think about it. Like there's something they're not telling me. But I doubt I'll ever get the real answer I'm looking for. All I know is this: I will never, ever live in a house with an attic again. Story 2, The Black Box. This happened when I was 14 or 15 years old. My family lived in this old house that had been passed down through generations on my dad's side. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him, and probably their parents before that. I don't live there anymore. I moved out for college and never moved back. But I still think about what I'm about to tell you. Probably more than I should. Like most old houses, it had an attic. And like most attics, it was basically a graveyard for stuff nobody wanted to deal with: old furniture, boxes of God knows what, Christmas decorations, broken appliances that might be worth fixing someday but never were. That last category, Christmas decorations, was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year right before the holidays to bring everything down, then once more in January to put it all back. This particular story happened around Christmas time, though Christmas itself has basically nothing to do with what happened. That year, my dad decided I was finally old enough to handle getting the decorations myself. He gave me the whole rundown, which boxes to look for, something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall, instructions about not mixing up the indoor and outdoor decorations. I nodded along like I was paying attention. I wasn't, not really. I was thinking about a video game I'd been playing or a girl I had a crush on or something equally unimportant. He finished his instructions and sent me up to the attic with the confidence of someone who assumed I'd actually been listening. I climbed the pull-down ladder and yanked the little chain that turned on the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I remember looking around and genuinely trying to recall the last time I'd been up there. It had to have been at least 2 or 3 years. Maybe longer. And then I realized there was a problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had actually told me to grab. I couldn't remember any of his specific instructions. And there was no way I was going back downstairs to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. He'd get legitimately angry if you made him say something twice. He took it as a sign of disrespect or laziness. So I just started opening random boxes, looking for anything that resembled Christmas decorations. I moved stuff around for probably 20 minutes, creating a complete mess in the process. Boxes stacked in new places, items pulled out and left sitting on the floor, complete disorganization. I did eventually find the Christmas stuff, which saved me from the humiliation of returning empty-handed. But the attic looked like a disaster zone by that point. I made 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, hauling boxes and bins and plastic tubs full of decorations to the living room. Once I was done with that, I went back up for one final check to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. And I knew I was going to have to reorganize everything up there. Put all the boxes back where they'd been, clean up the mess I'd made. I wasn't looking forward to it, but it had to be done before my dad came up here and saw what I'd done. As I was surveying the damage, mentally preparing myself for the reorganization job ahead, I saw something that caught my attention. In one of the back corners, kind of tucked behind several boxes I'd moved around, there was a container I hadn't noticed before. It was black, not cardboard like most of the boxes up there, but something sturdier. It looked like one of those fireproof document boxes, the kind with metal corners and a latch closure. Despite its heavy-duty construction, it somehow looked older than everything else in the attic. There was dust caked into every crevice, and the black finish was faded and worn in places. Being a curious teenager, I obviously opened it. Inside were papers. Dozens and dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. An alarming amount of paper for a single box. There were notebooks, the old composition kind with the black and white marbled covers. Loose pages covered in writing. Hand-drawn maps with labels and measurements. Even a few pages of what looked like sheet music. And every single item was completely covered in handwriting. Dense, cramped handwriting that filled every available space. The margins of the maps were filled with notes. The sheet music had words written between the staff lines. It was obsessive. Compulsive. The work of someone who couldn't stop writing. I started going through it, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The handwriting was difficult to decipher at first, cramped and irregular, like it had been written quickly or under stress. But the more I looked at it, the more my eyes adjusted to the specific quirks of the lettering, and I was able to start reading. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed to be stacked in rough chronological order. The older, more yellowed papers were on top. The newer-looking entries were near the bottom. I was so intrigued by this discovery, so captivated by the mystery of it, that I made a decision right then. I wasn't going back downstairs until I'd read through everything in that box. The earliest entries were mundane. Boring, even. Weather observations. Notes about household tasks that needed to be done. Random thoughts about the day, what someone had for breakfast, a conversation they'd had, plans for the weekend. It read like a disorganized diary, the kind of thing someone might keep just to have a record of their daily life. From the content and context clues, I was able to gather pretty quickly that whoever wrote all this had lived in this house. My house. They referenced rooms I recognized, mentioned the layout of the property. But as I kept reading, things started to change. The handwriting got more chaotic. Less controlled. The letters slanted at different angles, some lines pressed so hard into the paper that they'd torn through to the other side. And the content shifted too. The mundane daily observations gave way to something much stranger. Whoever wrote these entries had become obsessed with the attic. Not in a general, I need to organize the attic way. This was different. Intense. Consuming. They kept measuring it. Over and over. The dimensions of the attic, measured from different angles, at different times of day, recorded meticulously. And they kept comparing those measurements to the footprint of the house below. According to their calculations, which they showed in detail, complete with diagrams, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was missing space. Several feet along one of the walls that couldn't be accounted for. Space that existed according to the external dimensions of the house but didn't appear to exist in the accessible part of the attic. The entries about this missing space became more and more detailed. Obsessive doesn't even begin to describe it. They documented every single feature of the wall they suspected was hiding this space. Every crack in the plaster. Every discoloration. Every nail head and joint and imperfection. The level of detail was staggering. They'd measured the exact width of cracks down to fractions of an inch. They documented the precise location of stains and marks using a coordinate system they'd invented. It was the work of someone spiraling into madness. And then the entries got even worse. The writer started claiming they could hear sounds from behind the wall. From the hidden space. Scratching sounds. Breathing sounds. Movement. They included timestamps with these observations. 2:14 a.m. scratching sound, duration approximately 3 minutes, originating from 4 feet left of northeast corner. Page after page of these reports. Detailed logs of sounds they'd heard, complete with duration, intensity, their interpretation of what might be causing them. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. I was getting a first-hand account of someone's complete psychological breakdown. And there was nothing coherent about any of it by this point. The writing was barely legible. The thoughts jumped around randomly. Grammar and spelling deteriorated. It only got worse from there. The final pages weren't even sentences anymore. Just tally marks. Rows and rows and rows of them, counting something I couldn't identify. What were they counting? Days spent in the attic? Times they'd heard sounds? Something else entirely? I had no idea. And then the entries just stopped. Either the person had stopped writing, or that was as far back as the record went. By the time I finished reading through everything, I was genuinely shaking. I wanted to put it all back where I'd found it, close the box, go back downstairs, and forget I'd ever seen any of it. But there was something I had to do first. My eyes went straight to the wall the writer had been so fixated on. The wall with the supposedly missing space behind it. And the moment I saw that there actually were marks on that wall, cracks and discolorations that matched some of the descriptions I'd just read, I started feeling physically sick. I walked over to examine it more closely. And some of the features lined up almost exactly with what had been documented in those papers. A crack shaped like a Y. A stain that looked vaguely like a hand. An irregular patch where the plaster was a different texture. It was the kind of freaky coincidence that makes your skin crawl. I could picture the person who'd written those entries up here in this attic, kneeling in front of this wall, examining every inch of it, slowly losing their mind. And for a moment, it genuinely felt like they were here with me. Like I could feel their presence, their obsession, their madness seeping into my own thoughts. Suddenly, I didn't want to spend another second in that attic. I grabbed the black box and climbed down the ladder as fast as I could. I went straight to my dad. He was in the living room, starting to organize the Christmas decorations I'd brought down. I showed him the box and explained what I'd found. He was shocked. Genuinely shocked. He had absolutely no idea what any of it was, and he'd definitely never seen that box before in his life. He started going through some of the papers himself, his expression getting more and more disturbed as he read. After a few minutes, he said he was 100% certain it wasn't his father's handwriting. My grandfather's writing was neat and careful, he'd been an accountant. This handwriting was nothing like that. Which meant whoever wrote those entries must have lived in the house before my grandparents. Before my dad was even born. The problem was, my grandparents were both dead. Had been for years. And my dad knew absolutely nothing about the people who'd lived in the house before his family bought it. He studied the wall descriptions in the papers for a long time. Then he looked at me with this unreadable expression. "I'm going up there," he said. "I need to see this wall for myself." And to my surprise, and mild terror, he told me to come with him. I felt safer having him there, so I didn't argue. We climbed back up into the attic together. I stood off to the side while my dad examined the wall more closely than I had, using some of the pages as a guide, cross-referencing the descriptions with what he was seeing. After several minutes of careful inspection, he froze. He just stood there, staring at the wall, completely still. I thought maybe he'd given up, decided it was all nonsense. But then he turned to me with a strange look on his face. "I'm going to open this wall," he said. I was genuinely shocked. "What?" You're going to tear down the wall? There's something behind here, he said. I can feel it. The measurements in these papers, they are right. This space is wrong. I had no idea what to say to that, so I just nodded. My dad went down to the garage and came back with tools, a hammer, a pry bar, a flashlight. And then he started tearing into that wall. It took maybe 20 minutes. The wall wasn't as solid as it looked. The plaster came away in chunks, revealing old wooden lath underneath, which he pried apart board by board. And what we found behind it made both of us go completely silent. There was a space back there. A significant space, several feet deep, running the entire length of the wall. A hidden room that shouldn't exist. But that wasn't even the worst part. The walls of this hidden space, all of them, including the ceiling, were covered in markings. Not writing. Not words or letters or anything I could recognize as language. Just marks. Black lines, symbols, shapes that hurt to look at. They covered every surface in that hidden room, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. Some of the marks looked like they'd been made with charcoal or pencil. Others looked carved directly into the wood, deep gouges that must have taken hours to create. The amount of work represented in those walls was staggering. Whoever had done this had spent months, maybe years, covering every available surface. My dad and I just stood there, overwhelmed, unable to process what we were seeing. Eventually, once the initial shock wore off, we confirmed there was nothing else in the space. No furniture, no objects, no remains. Just the marks covering every surface. But then my dad pointed out something that made everything infinitely worse. Look at this, he said, gesturing to the wall we'd just torn open. This wall was sealed from the outside. There's no way into this space from in there. I didn't understand at first. If someone was marking up those walls, he continued, they had to get in there somehow. But there's no door. No hatch. No other entrance. He was right. The hidden space was completely sealed. The only way to access it was by tearing through the wall from the attic side. Which meant whoever had created all those marks had done so before the wall was sealed. They'd been locked inside when the wall was put up. Or, and this thought made my skin crawl, they put up the wall themselves from the inside, sealing themselves into that space deliberately. But that raised another, even worse question: how did they get out? My dad had this unreadable expression on his face, a mix of sadness and confusion and something else I couldn't identify. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. This box, these papers. He held up one of the notebooks. My father must have found these. He must have known about all of this. You think Grandpa put them in that box? I asked. It had to be him, my dad said. He found whoever's writings these were, gathered them together, stored them in that box, and hid it in the attic. But why wouldn't he tell you? I asked. Why hide it? My dad shook his head slowly. I have no idea. And I'll never know. He's gone. I could see how much that bothered him. The idea that his father had discovered something this disturbing in their family home and never mentioned it. Had kept it secret for decades. Why would he do that? What else had he known and not told anyone? We stood there in that attic for a long time, just staring at the torn open wall and the hidden space beyond it. My dad admitted to me years later that his father having withheld something like this from him, and the question of why he would do that, was something that would haunt him forever. And I don't blame him. It would haunt me too. As for me, I honestly don't know what to make of any of it. It happened so long ago that it almost feels like something I read in a book rather than something I actually experienced. But if I think about it for too long, I can still freak myself out. There's no reasonable explanation for what we found. None that makes any logical sense. I used to try to rationalize it. I tell myself that whoever wrote those entries was just insane. That they'd created the marks in that hidden space before the wall was sealed, probably while the house was being built or renovated. But there were things in those papers that someone could only know after the wall was put up. Descriptions of sounds coming from behind the sealed wall. Measurements taken from the attic side, comparing the expected dimensions to the actual accessible space. How could they document those things if they'd been sealed inside that hidden room? It truly makes no sense. There's no logical timeline where all the pieces fit together. And the question that haunts me most, if someone was sealed in that space, either deliberately or accidentally, how did they survive? How did they escape? Or did they? My dad wouldn't let me keep the box when we ultimately moved out of that house years later. He said it needed to stay with the property, that it was part of the house's history. For all I know, it's still up there in that attic. All I know is this is a mystery I'll take with me to my grave. Story 3, The Midnight Smoker. I've been a smoker for longer than I care to admit. 23 years now, give or take. At this point, it's less of a habit and more of a ritual, something to keep my hands busy, a way to mark the end of a long day. The thing is, I've always refused to smoke inside. My parents were the same way when they lived in this house, even though my dad would occasionally smoke cigars on the back porch during holidays or special occasions. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally pulled the trigger and moved down to Florida. They've been talking about it for years, the warm weather, the lower cost of living, being near the beach. But I think they needed to know the house would be in good hands before they could actually commit to leaving. I was divorced at the time, living in a depressing apartment that was way too small for a grown man, so the timing worked out perfectly. They signed the house over to me, and I moved in. My only complaint now is that the house actually feels too big. Which probably sounds absurd until you realize it's a 3-story colonial and I live here completely alone. The house also has this big backyard, probably close to an acre if you count the wooded part that borders the property. And I've gotten into the habit of taking these late-night walks out there while I smoke. It's peaceful. Meditative, almost. There aren't any neighbors close enough to see or bother me. The only light comes from my house, so usually it's just me and the crickets and whatever small animals are rustling around in the trees. I usually do a full loop around the property line, which takes about 10 minutes if I'm not rushing. It's become my version of meditation, I guess. Or maybe just my excuse to smoke in peace without feeling guilty about it. There's one thing you need to understand about this house before the rest of this story makes sense. The house is old. Really old. It was built in the 1890s, and while it's been maintained reasonably well over the years, it still has all the quirks of a building that's over a century old. The floors creak constantly. The windows are drafty. The pipes make odd sounds when you run water. It's practically impossible to move around in this house without making noise. It also has an attic, accessed through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's essentially a big storage room, just one large open space filled with my parents' old belongings that I haven't figured out what to do with yet. There's also a window up there. A tiny, original window that overlooks the backyard. It's maybe a foot wide, with this old wavy glass that distorts everything you see through it. It looks completely out of place against the modern vinyl windows on the rest of the house. I've looked up at that window hundreds of times during my nightly walks. Probably thousands of times over the 4 years I've lived here. It's never caught my attention before. Never seemed like anything other than a dark square of glass reflecting moonlight. That is, until about 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual loop around the property, maybe halfway through a cigarette, when I happened to glance up at the house. I don't know why, I wasn't thinking about the attic or anything specific. My eyes just drifted upward naturally. And for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind that little attic window. I stopped walking immediately and just stood there in the middle of the backyard, staring up at it. The window was dark, obviously. There's no light source up there unless you bring a flashlight. But I was almost positive I'd seen movement, a shape passing in front of the glass, maybe, or something shifting in the darkness behind it. I stood there for probably a full minute, watching that window, waiting to see if the movement would repeat. It didn't. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'd probably just seen the reflection of a cloud passing across the moon, or a bat flying past, or something equally mundane. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and didn't think about it again. The next night, though, I saw it again. This time I wasn't looking at the window when it happened. I was focused on the tree line at the back of the property, watching some kind of small animal, probably a rabbit, dart between bushes. But some instinct made me look up at the house. And the moment I did, I saw movement in that attic window. Not a reflection this time. Definite, unmistakable movement. Something dark passing across the glass from right to left. This time I was sure. There was something in my attic. My first rational thought was that it had to be an animal. Squirrels get into old houses all the time. There's probably a gap somewhere in the eaves or a loose soffit board they could squeeze through. But then I started thinking about what kind of animal would be large enough for me to see its silhouette from that distance, through that small window. And I didn't like any of the answers I came up with. A raccoon, maybe. Or worse, a possum. Or God forbid, something even larger. I went back inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the second floor where the attic access is located. I didn't hear any scratching or scurrying sounds. Didn't hear anything at all, actually. Which made sense, I guess. The attic floor is thick. Sound doesn't travel through it easily. But I knew I had to go up there. If there was an animal living in my attic, I needed to deal with it before it died up there or chewed through wiring or did whatever other damage wild animals do in enclosed spaces. So, reluctantly, I turned on my phone's flashlight and pulled down the attic ladder. The layout of the attic is such that you have to climb up somewhat blindly. You can't see what's at the top until your head clears the opening. If there was something dangerous lurking just beyond that opening, I wouldn't be able to see it until it was too late. That thought made the climb significantly more nerve-wracking than it should have been. But I forced myself to do it anyway. I climbed up slowly, shining my flashlight around as soon as my head cleared the floor level. And what I saw made me almost lose my grip on the ladder. It wasn't an animal up there. And it wasn't a person either. But the attic was absolutely destroyed. I don't mean messy or disorganized. I mean completely torn apart. Every box had been overturned. Every storage bin had been dumped out. Belongings were scattered everywhere. Clothes, books, old photo albums, Christmas decorations all mixed together in complete chaos. But that wasn't what made me freeze. Covering the walls, literally every wall, including parts of the slanted ceiling, was what looked like black paint. Thick, dark, dripping black paint smeared across every surface in chaotic patterns that made no sense. It looked disturbingly fresh. Still wet in places. Dripping slowly down the walls in thick rivulets. That initial glimpse freaked me out so much that I genuinely almost fell off the ladder. Because if that paint was still wet, that meant someone had been up here recently. Very recently. Which meant someone might still be up here. My brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Some homeless person or drug addict had broken into my house and was living in my attic. I did a quick sweep of the entire space with my flashlight, moving the beam frantically from corner to corner, looking for any sign of a person hiding among the overturned boxes. The attic isn't that large. It's basically just one big room with a slanted ceiling. There aren't a lot of places to hide. I didn't see anyone. But that didn't make me feel safer. If anything, it made me more afraid. If someone had been up here, and clearly someone had been, given the destruction and the paint, where were they now? I practically threw myself back down the ladder, my heart hammering so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. The moment I hit the second floor hallway, my fear turned to anger. Some freak had violated my home. My parents' home. And I was going to find them. I started tearing through the house, checking every room methodically. Closets, bathrooms, under beds, behind furniture, anywhere a person could conceivably hide. But I didn't find anything. And the more I searched, the more my anger gave way to confusion and renewed fear. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I was becoming acutely aware that I was alone in this big old house, and someone had definitely been inside it. I cleared the entire house, every floor, every room, and returned to my bedroom, thinking maybe I'd missed something obvious. But even after checking my room again, closet and all, I didn't find anyone. The moment I stopped moving and paused to catch my breath, though, I heard something. Thump. Thump. Two heavy sounds, followed by what sounded like something being dragged across a wooden floor. The sounds were coming from directly above me. Which could only mean one thing, the attic. Whoever was up there had never left. They'd probably been hiding behind one of those overturned storage boxes the whole time, waiting for me to leave. I don't know where the courage came from, it certainly wasn't rational thought. But something in me just snapped. This was my house. My parents' house. This person had violated something sacred, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. A 10-inch chef's knife that I could barely remember ever using. But I was ready to use it now. I went back upstairs, pulled the ladder down again, and started climbing. And then, because fear and anger had completely taken over any sense of rational behavior, I started screaming. Like a complete lunatic, I burst through the attic opening yelling at the top of my lungs, waving that knife around like some kind of maniac. Get out! Get the fuck out of my house! Part of it was anger. But honestly, most of it was pure fear. I was terrified, and the screaming was the only way I could force myself to keep moving. I stomped around the attic as aggressively as I could, kicking boxes, flipping over furniture, making as much noise as possible. But there was no one there. I was absolutely certain this time. I checked every corner, looked behind every pile of belongings, examined every possible hiding spot. The attic just isn't big enough to hide a full-grown person. It's one open space with nowhere to conceal yourself. There was nobody up there. But there was something new. Something that made every ounce of false bravery I'd managed to scrape together just evaporate instantly. Scratch marks. Deep, long gouges in the wooden support beams and floorboards. They looked like something with claws had been raking at the wood. Not random scratches, these were deliberate, violent, done with force. The marks were laid over the black paint in some places, which meant they'd been made after the paint. After I'd first come up to investigate. Someone, or something, had been up here in the time between my first visit and my second. And they'd clawed up the entire attic. That was it. I was done. I didn't care about being brave anymore. I didn't care about finding whoever had done this. I just wanted out. I ran back down to the first floor, went straight into the bathroom, locked the door, and called 911. The police arrived maybe 15 minutes later. It felt like hours. 2 officers went up to check the attic while I waited downstairs with a 3rd officer, giving my statement and trying not to sound completely insane. When the officers came back down, they confirmed what I already knew: the attic was empty. But they also said something that confused me: they couldn't find any gaps or openings large enough for a person to fit through. Whoever did this must have left through the house, one officer said. There's no other way out of that attic. I insisted that was impossible. I would have heard them. The house is incredibly creaky, even the slightest footstep makes noise that echoes through the whole structure. But the officers couldn't offer any other explanation. They took my statement, gave me a case number, recommended I install better locks and maybe get a security system. Then they left. It's been 3 weeks since that night. And thankfully, there haven't been any further incidents. No more movement in the attic window. No more sounds. Nothing. I guess I'm supposed to believe that some homeless person broke into my house, vandalized my attic for no apparent reason, and then somehow left without me noticing. But I don't believe that. I really don't. It doesn't explain the wet paint. How could paint stay wet for that long? It doesn't explain the scratch marks that appeared between my 2 visits to the attic. It doesn't explain how someone could have left the house without me hearing. Most of all, it doesn't explain why someone would do this in the first place. There was no theft. Nothing valuable was taken. It was just destruction. Chaos. What kind of person breaks into someone's home just to tear apart their attic and smear paint everywhere? I still haven't been back up there. Not even to clean the paint or straighten up the mess. I just can't bring myself to do it. Because deep down, I don't think it was a person who did this. I don't know what it was. But whatever is in my attic, or was in my attic, it's something worse than a home invader. And I honestly have no idea what to do about it. 3 people. 3 attics. 3 experiences that defy rational explanation. I want to thank everyone who shared their stories. Attics are supposed to be simple storage spaces, boring, dusty, forgettable. But sometimes, there's something else entirely. Something we'd rather not think about. If you found these stories compelling, please like and subscribe. And if you have an attic in your home and you've experienced something strange up there, drop it in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard. Stay safe out there. Lock your attic hatches. Check your spaces regularly. And remember, just because you don't go up there doesn't mean nothing else does. Until next time.